Hey guys, a couple of sections I wanted to talk about in Congress, the ones that are a little bit more complex, and these were areas you indicated you want a little bit more review. This is Unit 2.2. It deals with differences between the House and Senate and how that affects their ability to pass legislation. Remember, we have a bicameral legislature in part to make passing laws more difficult. We want there to be some differences in constituency and differences in term lengths, and those things affect the goals of each chamber when they're discussing legislation. And so the idea from Federalist 51 is if stuff is going to get passed, then it better be really, really good. Let's take a look at leadership positions in Congress. First, the Speaker of the House. This is obviously somebody from the majority party. They are second in line for the presidency behind the vice president, but they have a lot of formal powers that help them to get what they want in the chamber. They refer bills to committee and determine committee assignments, and so you can obviously shape how powerful those committees are based on who you put on them. You can reward individual congressmen for voting the party line by putting them on committees that will, I guess, get them better results for their constituents. Something like the Appropriations Committee would be valuable for congressmen because they're distributing federal funds. If you have a farming district and you get put on the Agricultural Committee, if you have a big defense company in your district and you get put on the Armed Services Committee, all of those things can be important to helping you get reelected. So there's a lot of power for the Speaker there. The Speaker is also in charge of determining which bills will make it to the floor, particularly because the Speaker controls who's on the Rules Committee. And we'll talk more about them later, but remember the Rules Committee helps to steer every bill that will make it to the floor by putting rules for amendment types and debates. And so the Speaker not only gets to decide who's on that committee, but the Speaker will often tell the committee what kinds of rules they're going to put for the bills that will make it to the floor. The Speaker also is in charge of guiding the floor debates, recognizing who will speak. So there's quite a bit of power for the Speaker of the House. On the Senate side, we talked about Mitch McConnell's particular skill in directing the Senate. Remember, as the majority leader, he also assigns committee members, but he primarily gets to determine which legislation will make it to the floor for discussion. Motions to proceed to consider individual bills are made by the majority leader. Remember, we had talked about the power by tradition for the majority leader to be recognized to speak first. And then that gives him the ability to determine kind of the direction of the chamber for the day. So there's a lot of informal power by the Senate Majority Leader. Not much of it is listed in their official rules. It's all based on chamber precedent, but that precedent affords him a lot of power to determine whether or not bills are even going to make it to the floor. The Majority Leader can also control the amendment process for legislation itself. Now, we're not talking about constitutional amendments. We're talking about amendments to pieces of legislation and whether or not amendments will be made on the floor during debate, how many. And so it's really overly complex, but essentially the majority leader can introduce amendments to a bill that not only change the content, but also then limit the ability of other senators to offer amendments. And so again, all of this just comes from simply the right of recognition to speak first. And so the majority leader, hugely powerful in the Senate. Some other leadership positions which we talked about. The president of the Senate is constitutionally speaking the vice president. They are not a regular voting member. They only vote to break a tie. The president pro tem is the longest serving member of the majority party, but it's pretty ceremonial, not much actual power there. On the House side, the majority leader is the number 2 in command, and they help to set committee chairs and to help in coordination with the Speaker. They help to steer which bills will go to which committees. There are minority leaders in both chambers, and they simply organize the opposition to the majority party's stuff. And then the whips. The whips are in charge of determining how party members are going to vote on a bill. They can help to broker deals to get votes from members who are on the fence, and they also work with the party leaders to coordinate overall strategy. And so in both chambers, most of the direction of the chamber is guided by party leadership. Okay, and that's the ceremonial positions. It's also things like the caucuses within each party, but party leadership determines a great deal about the type of legislation that will proceed through each chamber. And we talked about the importance of committees. Committees is where most of the work of Congress is done. And so we've got the standing committees, which are those permanent panels: Agriculture Committee, Armed Services, Housing and Urban Development. They're the ones who deal with those specific policy areas on a routine basis. Remember, their job is to hold hearings and gather information about a bill. They're going to hold a markup session to make changes to it, and also ultimately determine whether it moves on or whether it will be tabled or pigeonholed in committee. The membership reflects party control of the chamber. So if Republicans are in charge of the Senate, all of the committees will be led by Republicans, both in terms of their numbers and obviously in terms of the committee chairman. The chairman of each committee is selected by party leadership, and those chairmen within their committee get to determine which issues will be considered. They'll get to set conditions for how the hearings will go down, who will testify in those hearings. It used to be based on seniority, or whoever was there the longest, but it's no longer decided that way. Party leadership determines who will be the committee chairs. And so again, that can be a powerful tool to reward loyal voting and towing the party line. And then remember, each committee has several smaller subcommittees that deal with those specialized areas. There are other types of committees in Congress. You have joint committees for a couple of issues like taxation. They're made up of members from both chambers, and they're permanent, the joint committees, and they're dealing with policy areas that are likely to show up over and over and over again, like taxation. Select committees are temporary, and they're put together to deal with a particular current issue. Famous examples would be the Benghazi Committee to figure out what happened there. Back in the 90s, Congress, for some reason, put together a select committee to take a look at steroids in baseball, but select committees are temporary to deal with some problem. And then we had talked about conference committees. The conference committees are the ones when there are two different versions of a bill going through the two chambers. They have to settle those differences. Okay, you can't send two different tax rates to the president. They have to match. And so a conference committee would be after the House has passed it, after the Senate has done their work and passed it, but there are variations. The conference committee, a couple key members from each team that will put together a compromise bill that will then go back through both chambers and go to the president for a signature. A couple of procedural differences in the way the two chambers operate. So in the House, we have something called the discharge petition. Remember, if a bill is pigeonholed or tabled by committee, then a House member can file a motion to get that bill out of the committee anyway, even if they didn't like it, and have that bill sent directly to the House floor. But you need a majority of people to agree. So, okay, let's say Democrats right now. Republicans offer a bill, introduce a bill, it goes to committee, and the Democrats table it. So then a Republican files a motion to discharge that petition from the committee. It's very unlikely that that will be successful because you need a majority of members, and the chamber is controlled by Democrats. So it exists as a potential, but it's not often going to be successful. And then the last stop for any bill before it goes to the floor for debate is the Rules Committee. And it's nicknamed the Speaker's Committee because the Speaker gets to determine who's on it. The Speaker will often strongly suggest what types of rules the Rules Committee will put on a bill. And so this is for each piece of legislation. These aren't chamber rules. These are bill-specific rules that are determined for each piece of legislation that comes up. The types of rules they're going to put on it are things like, when will it even be considered by the entire chamber? How long will debate last? Can amendments be added? So they might even discuss not only whether or not amendments can be added, but the Rules Committee might themselves determine what amendments can be offered at that particular time. Germaneness rules, that means is the amendment relevant to the issue being discussed? And so all of those rules that the committee can put on obviously shape how the debate will go and ultimately whether or not the bill will be passed or not. So it's in the House, but not in the Senate. And then last is the Committee of the Whole. Remember, it's just simply a way for the House to get through legislation more quickly. It allows them, when they're operating as the Committee of the Whole, to bypass a lot of the typical rules that would slow things down. You only need a quorum of 100 people to do work as the Committee of the Whole. And so remember, the Committee of the Whole is basically a name they call themselves in order to bypass those rules. And then when they're done debating, they dissolve back to the House of Representatives, and then they have the full vote. Okay, so 3 important items in the House of Representatives that are different in the way they proceed through legislation. On the Senate side, remember, they pride themselves on unlimited debate, and individual senators have a lot more power to gum things up. A hold is a delay on the bill, and so when you tell the majority leader that you object to the bill, you're telling him that you're placing a hold on it. You're likely going to filibuster at any number of stops throughout the process. You can hold the motion to proceed. You can put a hold on the debate itself. You can put a hold while it's in committee, and so there's a lot that you can do to slow down and delay that process. The Senate operates on unanimous consent agreements. Everybody has to agree to bring a bill to consideration, and so this is often before we even get to the debate stage. It's simply on the motion to proceed. You need consent to even go ahead and move forward with debate. And so you're going to set unanimous consent agreements can be requested to set the limits on how debate will go. You can request that some of the typical rules be bypassed in order to pass legislation more quickly, but you need a unanimous consent to do that. And then the filibuster you should be familiar with. Those are those stall tactics that endlessly keep a bill from being moved forward to a vote. And so we had talked about that in the past, had been a lot of like actual talking for the filibuster, but now the holds themselves are often used so much so behind the scenes before we get to the actual debate stage that you don't often see it anymore. Remember the cloture vote. That's the vote to end debate and move forward with a vote, but you need 3/5, which is commonly known as a supermajority or 60 senators, in order to invoke cloture and end debate. And then last, remember, it's not necessarily about the debate itself, but remember the Senate is the only chamber that's involved with ratifying the president's treaties and confirming the president's nominations. So not necessarily a unique power or unique to the debate process, but it is a unique power of that chamber. Okay, the deal with all this stuff, make sure you're familiar with that vocab at the very least. But the key is, can you describe how those chamber differences affect the way legislation gets passed? Can you talk about how it affects the policy making process? I think you're maybe more likely to see that content as a whole come up with maybe something about how the differences between the chambers furthered goals of the founders and their design of those two chambers. And I could see that as an argument essay, describing not just a knowledge of what those differences are, but in relation back to constitutional foundation, something in the Federalist Papers. So that would be how I would go about this content. If you have any questions, send me an email.